The ballroom shimmered with golden light, chandeliers spilling brilliance across velvet drapes and polished marble. Waiters moved like shadows carrying trays of champagne. Laughter echoed against the high ceilings, and beneath the music, the subtle hum of competition lingered in the air. Everyone here had come to be seen. Everyone here wanted to matter. Elena Hayes had not come to matter. She had come out of duty. An art conservator by trade, she was used to quiet studios filled with the scent of varnish and the careful brush of restoration work, not roaring parties filled with men in tuxedos and women wrapped in glittering gowns. She was more comfortable breathing in history, tending to fragile canvases scarred by time, than in this room where everything felt like performance. She had chosen a simple dress navy blue. Nothing daring, nothing loud. It had cost her 3 months of careful saving, and she wore it with pride until the moment his voice found her. The sound cut through the symphony of chatter like a blade, smooth, arrogant, unforgettable. Daniel Cross, her ex-boyfriend, the man who had once held her hand as though she were the rarest treasure, and then tossed her aside when she no longer fit into his vision of greatness. Elena. His words rose above the crowd, pitched to draw attention. Heads turned, faces tilted toward them. His smile was broad, the kind of smile meant to show the world he had already won. On his arm stood Clarissa Duval, a woman dressed like liquid fire, her jewels catching the light at every angle. He didn't wait for her to answer. "Look at you. Still the same, aren't you?" His gaze swept her from head to toe, deliberate, cruel, still hiding behind little paintings. While the rest of us, he gestured around the ballroom with a flourish, as though he personally owned the night. Build empires. The laughter was not loud, but it was enough. It rippled through the group gathered around him, bankers, lawyers, investors, all eager to echo his arrogance. Elena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced her chin higher. "I restore art," she said evenly, her voice soft but steady. "I don't hide behind it." Daniel chuckled, a sharp, dismissive sound. Yes, the art doctor, breathing life into forgotten relics. Noble, I suppose, but not exactly impactful. He turned slightly, speaking loud enough for his circle to hear. Some people chase dust, others create legacies. His eyes glinted as they caught hers. "You always did prefer the past to the future." Clarissa gave a delicate laugh, resting her jeweled hand on his chest as if to punctuate his point. To the crowd, Elena was a footnote. To Daniel, she was nothing more than a prop for his performance. For a moment, Elena couldn't breathe. The sting was sharp, not just because of the words, but because once upon a time, she had loved him. Once, she had believed she was building a life with him. And now, before strangers, he made her a punchline. She mumbled something polite and stepped back, the edges of the room blurring as her vision prickled with unshed tears. She wanted to vanish into the polished floor, to be anywhere but here. Her hands trembled as she turned away, weaving through the crowd, desperate to escape the sound of his voice. But not all eyes in the ballroom had mocked her. In the corner, near the shadow of a marble column, a man had been watching, not with pity, not with amusement, but with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the glittering facade of the evening. Adrian Voss was not a man easily ignored, tall, composed, with the quiet authority of someone who never needed to prove himself. He had built industries that spanned oceans, yet tonight, the empires in his portfolio did not interest him. What caught his gaze was the woman retreating with quiet dignity after being humiliated. He had seen men like Daniel 1,000 times arrogant, shallow, mistaking cruelty for charm, and he had seen women wilt under such scorn. But this woman, though shaken, did not collapse. She walked with trembling hands, yes, but her back remained straight, her shoulders held. There was something about her presence that drew him, something he could not yet name. As Elena slipped out of the ballroom into the cool night air, her breath shuddered. The city lights blurred through the sheen of tears. She hated that he still had power over her emotions, hated that after all these years his words could still sting. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from the cold, but from the ache of being reminded that in Daniel's world, she was disposable. She didn't notice the man who had followed at a distance. Adrian lingered near the doorway, watching her silhouette against the city skyline. He did not speak, not yet. He only observed, a plan forming quietly in his mind. For Elena, this night felt like an ending another wound to add to the others. She had carefully hidden. For Adrian, it was a beginning. He had just witnessed something rare, something the rest of the room had been too blind to see. She thought she was walking away forgotten. He knew she was walking straight into a story no one would ever forget. The rain had a rhythm that evening, tapping against the windows of Elena's studio like a patient metronome. The storm outside suited her mood, restless, unsettled, filled with currents she could not control. She sat hunched over a canvas from the 17th century, a Dutch harbor scene darkened by decades of neglect. Her brush moved slowly, deliberately, coaxing life back into a corner of sky. Each stroke was a shield, a distraction from the echo of Daniel's laughter that still rang in her head. Her friends had told her not to go to that gala, not to put herself in the same room as him. But she had gone anyway, telling herself she could face it, that she was stronger now. And maybe she was, but strength did not stop the sting. It did not stop the way his words followed her, circling like birds of prey, still chasing dust. He had said. Elena pressed her brush harder against the canvas, almost breaking the delicate tip. She set it down with a sigh, flexing her trembling fingers. The storm rattled louder, and for a moment, she thought about turning the lights off and simply sitting in the dark. It was easier sometimes to hide, to let the world think she was invisible. But then the door to her studio opened without warning. Elena, Sophie's voice carried in before her sharp heels clicked against the wood floor. Sophie Chen never knocked. Best friends didn't need permission. A journalist with a flair for dramatics, Sophie always carried the air of someone who had just stepped off a breaking headline. She strode inside with a bag of takeout and a look that promised trouble. I brought noodles, and before you argue, you haven't eaten since, well, since humiliation was served to you on a silver platter 2 nights ago. Elena groaned, dropping onto the nearest stool. Do you have to remind me? Yes, Sophie said without hesitation, unpacking the containers. Because the only cure for public humiliation is greasy noodles and best friend pep talks. Eat. Elena obeyed, if only because she was too tired to fight. The warm food did help, a little. Sophie watched her closely, her eyes sharp but kind. You know he's pathetic, right? Sophie said, chopsticks waving for emphasis. Daniel thrives on tearing people down because that's the only way he feels tall. He's a cardboard king in a plastic kingdom. You restore beauty. You bring history back to life, don't you dare let him shrink you. Elena managed a weak smile. Sophie's words warmed her, but the bruise on her pride was still raw. It's just, he made me feel small, like I was nothing. You are not nothing, Sophie said firmly. And one day, he'll see it. Better yet, one day he'll regret it. Elena shook her head, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I don't care if he regrets it. I just want to forget. But forgetting wasn't easy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his smug grin. Every time she thought she'd buried the memory, it clawed its way back. And what she didn't know, what Sophie didn't know, was that someone else had been thinking about her too, across the city, in a corner office that overlooked the storm-swept skyline. Adrian Voss studied a different kind of canvas. Numbers glowed on his screen, reports of mergers and markets, graphs rising and falling like tides. But his thoughts weren't on the numbers. They kept returning to the woman at the gala, the one who had walked away with her dignity intact even when mocked in front of strangers. Most people in his world were predictable, hungry for money, power, recognition. But she had been different. There had been hurt in her eyes, yes, but also a quiet fire, a refusal to collapse. That had caught his attention. That had made him wonder. He closed the laptop, leaning back in his chair as lightning split the sky. His empire had been built on instincts, on seeing value where others overlooked it. And now, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, his instincts told him Elena Hayes mattered. Not in the way Daniel had dismissed her, not as someone to be mocked, but as someone whose worth ran deeper than the glittering crowd would ever understand. The storm continued, both outside and inside. Back in her studio, Elena finished her meal and pushed the carton away. She returned to her canvas, picking up her brush again. Her strokes were slower now, steadier, as though Sophie's words had carved out a little space for healing. But even as she painted, even as she tried to quiet her thoughts, she felt a strange shift in the air, as though the night itself had begun to turn, preparing her for something she could not yet imagine. Somewhere in the storm, paths were moving toward each other. She believed she was forgotten, but someone was already watching, already waiting, ready to step into her life in a way that would change everything. The story she thought had ended was only beginning, and the echo of Daniel's cruel laughter would one day be drowned out by something far greater. The following weeks carried Elena into a rhythm that felt safe but heavy, like walking through water. She filled her days with work, restoring paintings for the museum, and her evenings with quiet dinners alone, the hum of her kettle becoming the closest thing to conversation. The sting of Daniel's words still lingered, sometimes hitting her. At odd moments, the silence after finishing a canvas, the pause before sleep, the reflection of her own eyes in the bathroom mirror. She tried to convince herself it didn't matter. He was just a man, just one cruel voice. But when humiliation strikes in public, it has a way of echoing louder than private victories. And then, as life often does, the world began to shift. It started with something small. She had been asked to consult on a collection for a private patron, an unusual request that came through the museum director. The client wanted discretion and had specifically requested her expertise. Elena had assumed it was some wealthy family wanting their heirloom restored before an auction. She nearly declined. The timing felt wrong. Her heart still fragile, but something in the director's eyes made her pause. They're insistent, he said, and the compensation is generous. So she went, arriving at a quiet estate outside the city, where the gates alone could have been mistaken for a national monument. The air smelled faintly of cedar as she was ushered through gardens sculpted with impossible precision. Inside, the art collection stunned her, pieces she'd only seen in textbooks, each one guarded by immaculate lighting and climate-controlled. And then he appeared. Adrian Voss stepped into the gallery as though he belonged to the silence itself. His presence was undeniable, calm, steady, not loud but commanding. He extended a hand, his gray eyes steady on hers. "Miss Hayes, thank you for coming." She blinked, startled. "You requested me?" "I did," he said simply, as though it explained everything. "Your reputation precedes you." Her cheeks warmed. Reputation. The word tasted strange after Daniel's public dismissal. But Adrian spoke it without irony. He gestured toward a painting, a storm-tossed seascape darkened with centuries of grime. "This piece deserves someone who sees beyond what's obvious. I believe that's you." The hours passed quickly as Elena examined the painting, sketching notes and discussing potential treatments. Adrian didn't hover, but he listened, really listened. His questions weren't like the shallow ones she was used to hearing at galas, where people pretended to care about art while waiting for the champagne refill. He wanted to understand. He wanted her perspective. It unsettled her. It intrigued her. That night, driving home, she couldn't shake the way his eyes had lingered, not with pity, but with a curiosity that felt dangerous. She told herself not to read into it. He was a client, nothing more, a man with wealth and taste, interested in preserving his collection. But still, the echo of his attention stayed with her like a candle's afterglow. The universe, however, wasn't finished weaving its threads. A week later, Elena found herself at another event, this one smaller, hosted by the museum in honor of a new exhibition she hadn't wanted to attend. But Sophie insisted, practically dragging her by the arm. "You can't hide forever," Sophie said. "Besides, it'll be full of people who actually value art, not walking egos." But fate is rarely so kind. Daniel was there. She saw him the moment they stepped inside, his posture arrogant as ever, his laughter too sharp, his arm still looped around Clarissa's. He hadn't seen her yet, but the mere sight of him made her chest tighten. She told Sophie she wanted to leave, but before she could escape, his voice carried again. "Elena?" He turned, flashing that smile, as though the world were his stage. "Well, if it isn't the curator of dust herself, still keeping busy with your little brushes?" Sophie bristled, ready to unleash a verbal storm, but Elena raised a hand. silencing her. This time, she wasn't going to retreat. Something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the memory of Adrian listening so intently. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of being small. She met Daniel's gaze steadily. "Yes," she said, "I restore things. Broken things. Forgotten things. That's what I do. And it's worth more than mocking people to feel important." The words stunned even her. A ripple of silence followed, the kind that comes when truth slices through pretense. Daniel's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered with a scoff. But it was too late. The moment had passed, and Elena had stood her ground. What she didn't realize was that someone else had witnessed it. From across the room, Adrian observed, his expression unreadable, but his interest undeniable. He had seen her before, shaken but unbroken. Now he saw her steady, standing against a man who had once reduced her to a whisper. And Adrian, a man who had built an empire on recognizing resilience, knew he was watching a rare kind of strength. Elena left the event that night with her heart racing, unsure whether she had just embarrassed herself or reclaimed something she had lost. All she knew was that she felt different, stronger. And somewhere behind the scenes, Adrian Voss began to make decisions that would draw their paths even closer. Choices that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, about love, and about the future she had nearly stopped believing she deserved. The storm of the past was not over, but something brighter was breaking through the clouds. Something she could not yet name, but would one day change the shape of her entire life. The days that followed were both exhausting and strangely electric for Elena. She returned to her studio, immersing herself in the storm-tossed seascape Adrian had entrusted to her care. Every layer of soot she lifted, every crack she filled, felt like stitching together not just a painting, but fragments of her own strength. Still, beneath the steady rhythm of her work, a question pulsed. Why had Adrian Voss chosen her? Of all the restorers in the city, some more seasoned, some more celebrated. Why her quiet studio? Her modest skills? She told herself it was coincidence, but in the still hours of night, she wasn't so sure. Her thoughts were interrupted one evening, when Sophie arrived with her usual burst of energy, carrying coffee and a stack of newspapers. "Guess who made the financial pages again?" Sophie announced, slapping down the front page. Adrian's name was splashed across the headline, "A billion-dollar merger," that left competitors reeling. His photo showed him standing stone-faced, exuding the kind of power that made others lean back. Sophie smirked knowingly. "You realize this man is orbiting your life, right?" Elena rolled her eyes, reaching for the coffee. "He's a client, Sophie, that's all. Please." Sophie shot back. "Clients don't look at you like you're the only person in the room. And don't tell me you didn't notice, because I was there. He watched you at the exhibition. He watched you stand up to Daniel." The mention of Daniel made Elena's stomach tighten. She had replayed that moment 100 times. Standing her ground had felt powerful, but also terrifying. What if she had looked foolish? What if Adrian had only seen her as a stubborn woman trying to save face? Her doubts grew heavier when, 2 days later, she walked into the museum only to hear hushed whispers spreading like smoke. She caught her name paired with Daniel's, then fragments of laughter. Still clinging to old canvases? Poor thing, does she really think anyone notices her? The sting was back, sharper, because it came not from him directly, but from the echoes he had planted in others. The humiliation seemed to grow legs, following her into spaces she once thought safe. That night, she slumped into her studio chair, tears pressing hot against her eyelids. She hated how easily the voices got under her skin. She hated that after everything, she still cared, but she wasn't as alone as she thought. The knock on her door startled her. When she opened it, Adrian stood there, rain clinging to his coat, his gaze steady. "I was nearby," he said simply, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. He stepped inside, taking in the half-finished painting, the clutter of brushes, the scattered pages of notes. For a man whose life was precision, her chaos should have felt jarring. Instead, he seemed at ease, as though this space told him something about her that he already valued. "You look tired," he observed, not unkindly. "I'm fine," she lied, brushing her sleeve across her eyes. His silence pressed against her. Excuse, unraveling it without effort. You don't have to be. Something inside her cracked at his words. She wanted to argue, to push him away. But instead she found herself confessing. He still gets to me. Even now, I thought I was over it. But I'm not. Adrian didn't interrupt. He listened. The way he always did, as though her words were rare and worth collecting. When she finished, embarrassed by her own vulnerability, he finally spoke. You think his cruelty defines you, he said softly. It doesn't. It defines him. What I saw that night wasn't a woman broken by humiliation. I saw someone who didn't crumble when the world tried to make her small. That strength is rarer than you realize. Her breath caught, because the conviction in his voice was something she hadn't felt in years. Daniel had called her insignificant so many times that she had started to believe it. But here was Adrian, a man who commanded entire industries, insisting she was anything but. The silence stretched, charged and fragile. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time noticed the weariness in his eyes, the kind that comes not from weakness but from carrying too much for too long. He wasn't just power and polish. He was human, and that humanity called to her in a way she didn't want to admit. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. I have to go, he said, his voice clipped now, the businessman, slipping back into place. But I'll see you again soon. When the door closed behind him, Elena stood frozen, her heart racing. The storm inside her hadn't calmed, it had shifted, pulling her in a direction she didn't understand. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Carter poured himself a drink, smirking as he read the latest gossip column that had reduced Elena's dignity to another cruel joke. He had no idea that the woman he had mocked was no longer walking alone, and that the man quietly stepping into her life was someone far beyond his reach. The lines were being drawn, though Elena could not yet see them. She thought she was simply surviving. She didn't know she was standing at the edge of a transformation, one that would not only silence the laughter of her past, but ignite a story powerful enough to echo far beyond her own imagination. The world she knew was about to tilt, and for the first time, she was not afraid of falling. The morning of the gala arrived with the weight of a storm. Even though the skies were clear and the city basked in golden sunlight, Elena stood before her mirror, smoothing the folds of a dress she never would have chosen for herself. It had been Sophie's doing, an emerald gown that caught the light with every movement. Bold but elegant, a far cry from the modest clothes Elena usually favored. Sophie had insisted, if you're going to walk back into the lion's den, you're going to shine. No more shadows, Elena. Not tonight. Her heart thudded with unease. She wasn't sure she wanted to shine. She wanted to disappear, to quietly do her work and live her life unseen. But fate had grown tired of letting her hide. Adrian had arranged for her to attend the museum's largest charity gala of the year, not as a guest tucked into a corner, but as someone to be honored for her restoration work. When she'd protested, he'd only given her that calm, unshakable look. People should see what you do. He'd told her, they should know who you are. The words had lingered, stirring something in her chest, something dangerously close to hope. The gala glittered with chandeliers and polished marble, a stage where fortunes and reputations were displayed like jewels. Elena entered with Sophie at her side, her pulse racing as eyes turned toward her. She told herself it was the gown, the shimmer of green against her pale skin. But then she saw Adrian across the room, his gaze steady, unflinching, and she knew. Better, he had wanted her to be seen, and now she was. But so was Daniel. He appeared at the edge of the crowd, a glass in hand, Clarissa glittering beside him like an accessory. His smirk widened as he spotted Elena. He leaned close to Clarissa, whispering something that made her laugh, then began to make his way through the crowd. The air tightened, the sound of clinking glasses fading as if the room itself anticipated the confrontation. Elena, Daniel drawled when he reached her, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention. I must admit, I'm surprised. You clean up well, though I suppose it's easy to shine when you're borrowing the spotlight of others. Sophie bristled, ready to cut him down, but Elena lifted her chin, stopping her friend with the smallest shake of her head. Something inside Her had changed since that night in her studio when Adrian told her cruelty defined the cruel, not the victim. She was done letting Daniel's words write her story. "I don't need your spotlight, Daniel," she said evenly, her voice strong enough to carry. "I've found my own." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was subtle, but it was enough to knock the smug tilt from his smile. For the first time, Daniel looked unsettled, caught off guard by her refusal to play the part he had written for her. And then, as though timed by destiny itself, Adrian stepped forward. His presence was quiet, but undeniable, commanding without theatrics. He moved to Elena's side, his gaze brushing over Daniel with a cool indifference that said more than words ever could. "Miss Hayes," Adrian said, his tone smooth, respectful, the opposite of Daniel's mocking sneer. "The museum board is eager to speak with you. They're impressed by your work. Shall I escort you?" Elena's breath caught. The words were simple, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't just offering her an exit. He was placing her in the center of the room, aligning her not with mockery, but with respect, with recognition. Daniel's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth as if to retort, but the crowd's attention had already shifted. They were no longer watching him. They were watching Elena, the woman who had been dismissed, diminished, and laughed at, now standing beside one of the most powerful men in the city. That it was not a rescue. It was a revelation. The night unfolded in a blur. Elena found herself speaking to curators, patrons, and scholars who praised her work with genuine admiration. For the first time, she wasn't simply the quiet figure in the background. She was a voice, a presence, someone whose worth was undeniable. Adrian never hovered, never spoke for her, but his steady presence was a shield, a silent declaration that she belonged here. Later, when the speeches ended and the music softened into something slower, Adrian found her near the balcony overlooking the city. The lights stretched endlessly below, a map of possibility. "You handled him well," Adrian said, his voice low. Elena laughed softly, though her hands still trembled. "I thought I might faint." "You didn't," he replied. "You stood. That's what matters." She turned to look at him, her chest tightening with emotions she couldn't name. Gratitude, admiration, something deeper, more dangerous. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could have chosen anyone else to restore your collection, to stand here tonight. Why me?" Adrian's gaze held hers, steady as ever. "Because you see value where others don't. Because you refuse to let what's broken stay broken. That matters to me." The words settled into her like seeds planted in fertile ground, waiting to grow. And in that moment, Daniel Carter, watching from across the room with bitterness curdling in his chest, realized something he had never imagined. Elena Hayes was no longer his footnote. She was becoming a story the world would remember. What none of them yet knew was that the true turning point had only just begun. What Adrian had set in motion tonight would ripple far beyond a single gala, reshaping not just Elena's future, but the lives of everyone who had ever doubted her. The laughter of the past was fading. The sound of something greater, something like destiny, was rising to take its place. The night of the gala had ended with Elena standing on the balcony beside Adrian, the city lights stretching endlessly below them. That image clung to her in the days that followed, replaying every time she picked up her brush. The sound of Daniel's voice had begun to fade, replaced by something else, her own words, steady and unshaken, and Adrian's, quiet but firm, telling her that her strength mattered. For the first time in years, she no longer felt like a shadow. She felt like she was becoming someone visible, someone whole. But life has a way of testing new strength, and Elena's test came sooner than she expected. A feature appeared in one of the city's most read magazines, not about Adrian or his empire, but about her. The headline surprised her: "The woman who brings history back to life." Inside was a spread of photographs of her studio, her hands carefully restoring paintings, her quiet concentration illuminated in golden light. The article praised her talent, her dedication, even her resilience after years of working in obscurity. At first, Elena thought it was Sophie's doing, another of her friend's crusades to remind the world that Elena mattered. But when she reached the last line, she saw a quote: "She restores more than paintings. She restores dignity, beauty, and worth." The world needs more people who see what others overlook. Adrienne Voss, her breath caught. It wasn't just an article. It was a declaration that the world reacted quickly. The museum received calls from patrons eager to commission her expertise. Invitations arrived to speak at universities and cultural events. And with every new opportunity, Elena felt the walls of the small life she had once settled for began to widen. But with the widening came whispers, jealousy from those who had once ignored her, and bitterness from Daniel, whose smug facade began to crack. It reached a breaking point one evening when she was invited to speak at a charity dinner hosted at one of the city's grandest hotels. Elena had rehearsed her speech 100 times. Her nerves tangled, but her resolve steady. Sophie was there, squeezing her hand, and Adrian sat near the front, his gaze a steady anchor. She had just begun to speak when the interruption came. Daniel rose from his table, his voice carrying across the room like poison wrapped in velvet. "Impressive," he said loudly, his smile sharp. "From forgotten art to society's darling. Quite the leap, Elena. Tell me, is it talent, or simply the advantage of standing near men with deeper pockets?" The room went still. All eyes turned to her. The humiliation he wanted was clear. He wanted to reduce her to dependency, to make her feel small again. Elena's chest tightened. But this time, she didn't tremble. She met his gaze across the room. The sting of old wounds still there, but dulled by the weight of what she had built since. Her voice was calm when she answered. "I don't stand near power," she said. "I stand on my own. My work speaks for itself, and anyone who thinks otherwise isn't listening." The silence that followed was sharp, broken only by a few scattered claps that quickly swelled into applause. Daniel's smirk faltered as the crowd turned from him to her, their approval clear. His attempt to drag her down had failed, and worse, it had exposed him for what he truly was. As the applause grew, Adrian rose. He crossed the room with quiet certainty and, in full view of everyone, took her hand. His voice, though steady, carried with ease. "She doesn't need anyone to speak for her," he said. "But let me say this, in a world full of people who build towers only to stand taller than others, Elena Hayes builds something far greater. She builds what lasts. And I would be proud beyond proud to stand beside her for the rest of my life." For the words stole the breath from the room. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide, and Elena, her heart racing, her mind spinning, felt the ground tilt beneath her. Adrian lowered himself slightly, not with the theatrical flourish of a man performing for attention, but with quiet sincerity. He opened a small box, the diamond inside catching the light like captured fire. "Elena, will you marry me?" The world seemed to stop. For one moment, all she could hear was the echo of Daniel's laughter from months ago, the cruel certainty with which he had called her nothing. And now, here she stood, not forgotten, not diminished, but chosen by a man who saw her, who valued her, who believed in her strength. Her eyes blurred with tears as she whispered, "Yes." The applause that followed shook the walls. Daniel slipped back into the shadows, his glass forgotten, his smirk erased. And Elena, once mocked as a footnote, was now the headline of her own story. Later that night, as she stood on the balcony, with Adrian, the city glowing below, she let the truth settle in. She had thought her story was about survival, about enduring humiliation, but it had become something else. It had become about transformation, about rising not just despite the cruelty, but because of it. She wasn't the woman left behind. She was the woman who had been found by herself, by her worth, and by a love that refused to diminish her. And in that realization, she knew this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a life she had once believed was impossible. A life where her voice mattered, where her work mattered, and where her heart, at last, was free.